Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We finished off the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday nights, and so for the next Sunday night series, we're going to walk through the book of Ecclesiastes in bits and pieces. This is going to begin, this upcoming Sunday evening, which is going to be the previous Sunday evening by the time this actually gets posted on Friday, and hopefully we'll go through it every couple of weeks. We'll hit a sermon on this and one day make it through the book. Not exactly sure how many sermons it's going to be. Haven't mapped it all out yet. I'll get to it eventually. The reason I picked Ecclesiastes is it is one of my favorite books. It's also very important for people to understand. It is highly relevant, especially I think in today's day and age. It's very, very useful and very, very good to know and just kind of have as a background when you're thinking about biblical things or anything related to God. Ecclesiastes is really important for that. And when I taught the How to Read the Bible class on Sunday morning, and we covered a little bit of Ecclesiastes, a brief Ecclesiastes overview. I asked the people in the class how many of them were familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, and I got 0 hands in response. So that is slightly depressing. It is not surprising. If you know much about Ecclesiastes, you're probably in the minority of people. Most people don't know much about this book, and those who do know a lot about this book tend to avoid it, because Ecclesiastes can be a little bit depressing, as you're going to find when we delve into the sermon, but I think it's useful and it's good for us to know, and so we're going to talk about it anyway. I've decided if you are on the video version of this, I'm probably going to try and use PowerPoint for this. PowerPoint I use it basically to help me keep track of where I am in my notes, and so I may as well put it up there as a little bit of a visual aid if you are that way, and if you use that to keep track of your notes, and if not, or if you're just listening to this as an audio, then it doesn't matter, and so may as well do it because nobody cares either way. Ecclesiastes 1 is a fascinating chapter in which the preacher puts forth a premise. Basically, it's a whole thesis statement on his view of life. And so you start by asking this question. It's a very basic question, and it's a very generic question that I mean as generically and as unhelpfully as possible. You ask the question, what even is the point? Just sit with that for a minute. What is the point? The point of what, we like to ask. Well, I'm not defining that for you. I'm just saying go ahead, try to find anything that provides a reasonable answer. Why do you exist? Why do you live? What purpose do you have? Do you have a purpose? Can you even have a purpose? Why do we think there's such a thing as good? Why do we think there's such a thing as evil? Why do we consider one of those better than the other? Why try to pursue one over the other? Why do you make choices to try and better yourself? Can you even better yourself? Is that possible, or is that just an idea that we have in our heads that make us feel better, but you can't actually do anything about it? Does that concept even exist? Is there a better or a worse version of yourself? And can you make the choice to change between the two, or are you just kind of stuck with whomever you are? All of these kinds of questions, these existential and reality warping assertions come under fire when you enter the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're going to be talking about some of these and much more and much broader topics as we go in through the next few Sunday nights. Ecclesiastes ends up being one of my favorite books because it addresses stuff like this, and it is essential for us to understand it. If you're coming to God with a bunch of preconceived notions, Ecclesiastes helps to break those down and rid you of those preconceptions so that you can actually step into the presence of God and understand what He wants for you. So, fair warning here at the beginning of the series. Several of these sermons, including this one, are going to be way more depressing than you would like them to be, and way more depressing than you may be expecting, because Ecclesiastes, I'm going to say this at the front, I'm going to say this right up front, and I'm going to say it at the end in some form as well. Ecclesiastes is very depressing because it's pointing out to you the harsh reality of living in life. We like to exist in a life that's happy. We like to ignore the bad things around us. We like to pretend that everything's going to be okay. And Ecclesiastes, especially chapter 1, is built to disabuse you of that notion Basically, it's a slap in the face, and it's the harsh reality of the situation. The fact is, I don't feel bad about preaching something like this, because in order to reach the house of God, sometimes you have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, as it were. You have to recognize how horrible things are to recognize how glorious God is. So don't forget that God is present. But also, Ecclesiastes 1 is kind of a practice of recognizing you don't get to hand-wave reality just because God is present. God is alive, sure, but Ecclesiastes doesn't really talk about that at all, or at least not chapter 1. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, what we're talking about today is how life is meaningless and everything is awful and just you can't escape. So good luck as you live in the void. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Let's go ahead and read chapter 1 together. It is a depressing chapter, and hopefully it rings true to the things that you have experienced. Ecclesiastes 1, starting in verse 1. I'll be using New American Standard. I have the 2025 version with me, so I'll be using that for this series. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Futility of futilities, says the preacher. Futility of futilities, all is futility. What advantage does a person have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises, and the sun sets, and hurrying to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south and turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the places where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome. No one can tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. So there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, "See this, it is new"? It has already existed for ages which were before us. There is no remembrance of the earlier things, and of the later things as well, which will occur, there will be no remembrance of them among those who come later still. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom about everything that has been done under heaven. It is a sorry task with which God has given the sons of mankind to be troubled. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is futility and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom, and to know insanity and foolishness. I realized that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. So hopefully you are aware of how horrible all of that is. And if you are not, or if you cannot fully appreciate how terrible the reality this man is describing is, that's what we're going to do for the next 30 or 40 minutes, or however long this takes, is we're going to talk about some of that. Because reality is a horrible, horrible thing. You would look at this teacher, and he's a curious guy. You would describe him as someone who is like jaded, as the title says. I might call him world weary. He's a man who has seen too many things, is a way we would talk about someone like this. Someone who is a little too aware of life. We survive in life, and a lot of humans get by in life and do pretty well in life by ignoring a lot of the things we see in life and trying to just kind of wipe those out or filter those through, or we don't need the unpleasant thoughts or the unpleasant memories, and we don't need any of that stuff. We get rid of that. This is a man who can't do that. He is a little too aware of the horrible things that happen in the world around him. We don't get very much information about who this writer is, this teacher. He is identified in chapter 1 and verse 1, in chapter 1 and verse 12. There's a hint in chapter 1, verse 16, maybe, and then there's a little brief note in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. I'll show you what all of those are. Chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Chapter 1 and verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. There's a clue. Chapter 1, verse 16, I said to myself, behold, I've magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. So there's an idea. He's very, very wise, wiser than anyone else. That might be a clue. It may be a bit of hyperbole, but it may be a clue to his actual position. And then you can jump down to Ecclesiastes 12 and verses 9 and 10. In addition to being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. And that's about all you have on who this preacher actually is. He is described as a wise man, or a teacher, a preacher, a son of David, king in Jerusalem. The typical assumption, especially when you factor in chapter 1 and verse 16, if that is a truthful and legitimate statement that I am the wisest person who's ever ruled in Jerusalem, then one would assume that this is presumably Solomon who's writing. Some have suggested that this is not Solomon, but it's someone writing as if they are Solomon. I think that would destroy the point of the book, and so I don't believe that's what it is, but people have that opinion. Some people have that opinion, so may as well mention that just so you can clock that in your head and see if that works for you or not. Ultimately, I'm not sure if Solomon wrote it or not. I tend to think probably so. I go with the traditional interpretation of who wrote books of the Bible because, best bet is that's probably right, and if not, I don't really care because most or all of the time it doesn't really matter. And so I don't really care if Solomon actually penned the words to this book or not. I think it makes sense for Solomon to have done it, but I really don't care. And if you disagree, then whatever. He doesn't identify himself as Solomon. He does identify himself as the preacher, or in the original language, it's pronounced something, it's written something like Koheleth with a Q. So that's probably what I'll call him as we go throughout this, is the teacher or the preacher or Koheleth instead of using Solomon. If I do accidentally say Solomon, I probably don't mean to, but I may use it sometimes because, it's fine as a baseline assumption for who maybe wrote the book, and I don't really care. Of note, I would point out the fact that this book is very interesting. It seems that this Koheleth, this teacher fellow, wrote chapter 1 in verse 2 down through chapter 12 in verse 8, but didn't write the rest of it. Chapter 1 in verse 1 is this impersonal kind of third-person introduction. Hey, these are the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And it seems kind of weird for someone to introduce himself in verse 1 and then introduce himself again in verse 12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and just kind of repeating everything. And so what I've heard about this and what I generally agree with is I think this preacher fellow wrote from chapter 1 and verse 2, futility of futilities, says the preacher, futility of futilities, all is futility. And he wrote, that was his first verse, and he wrote all the way down through chapter 12 and verse 8, futility of futilities, says the preacher, all is futility. There are nice little bookends there, and then someone else added chapter 1 and verse 1 to clarify who was speaking right up front, and that same someone presumably came around and added chapter 12 verses 9 through 14 as a kind of epilogue to the book, where he says, let me explain some more things about the preacher, and he gives you those details, and then he writes a couple last statements, and he ends you off pointing to God. If Solomon did write this book, I think he did write chapter 1 and verse 2 to chapter 12 and verse 8, but I don't think Solomon's the one who came up with the application to fear God and keep his commandments. It's a logical application to make, but I don't think Solomon made that application. So I'm not one of those who believes Solomon was saved at the end of writing all of this. I think he's probably in hell because he's a terrible person. But, you can differ on that if you want to, and I don't really care because we'll see on Judgment Day, and either way, I'm not in charge of him. So whatever. He made his own choices wherever he ends up, and wherever God's mercy takes him, well, that's good. Or bad, depending on how much he was able to benefit from the mercy of God. The book proper starts with futility as a concept, verse 2, and it ends with futility as a concept, chapter 12, verse 8, only then for an editor to say, by the way, remember that God exists. And that's really the lesson you should take away here. So what do we know about this man? Well, you have to look at his qualifications, right? You think about these things. We already touched on them. But think about our reaction to these things, and then think about the teacher's reaction to these things. He is the son of David. That means he has a great lineage. He comes from a great line of people. He's connected to a family line of great importance to the Bible story and to the things that God is doing on a whole. We tend to think that that kind of lineage is an honor. We think that, someone bears the title Son of David. Wow, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty great. But notice when the preacher introduces himself in chapter 1 and verse 12, he doesn't even mention that. He doesn't seem to care. He never calls himself the Son of David. He doesn't live up to that title in any way. When you read through the book, it seems like he is not really connected to God much at all. He doesn't really care about being the Son of David. Well, we see that he's the king, and the king has an idea of great importance to it. The king, the ruler of the nation, it's an impressive position, and we'd see that as great. But when you read through the section, it really doesn't seem like he sees that much benefit in it. And especially as you read through the rest of the book, he doesn't put importance in being the king. He says it's an added burden. He says it's an extra responsibility. He says there's extra stuff that you have to do. That's not really a blessing. We think of that as something that is great and wonderful, but the king, the preacher, the king, doesn't. We think he's king in Jerusalem. He has a great opportunity. This is the city of God, and he gets an opportunity to serve God. But again, the preacher doesn't really do that. He doesn't really talk about that much. The one time he specifically does talk about serving God, he says, when you go into the temple, be careful to shut your mouth because God really doesn't want to listen to you. Ecclesiastes 5 in verses 1 and 2. And you may think that's pretty strong, but it's really not. Go read Ecclesiastes 5 verses 1 and 2, and you'll realize he is pretty harsh on that. He doesn't seem to be that interested in being ruler of Jerusalem. It's God's city. So what? That just means more responsibility, doesn't it? Or maybe we would look at him and say he's a teacher. That means he has great wisdom. He's the preacher. He gets to pass on this wisdom to the next generation. But even in that, you go ahead and look down in verse 16. I've magnified, I've increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. My mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And then verse 18, all I have is pain. The point is, even though he instructs present and future generations, he even says that wisdom itself is a horrific thing to do to oneself. Everything in Koheleth is fighting against himself, and it is very much just the struggle of being alive, isn't it? He has all these great titles, but he's recognized none of them really mean anything. When you think about the preacher, what we're looking at is a man who is presumably older. You're going to see in more detail in chapter 2 if you don't know that already. He's got some experience under his belt. He knows what he's talking about. He knows all that life has to offer. He's been around the world for a bit. And he's found out that all of it is worthless. The teacher's attempt, I think, is to, especially when you think about the early portion of chapter 12, or later portion of chapter 11, early part of chapter 12 is, remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come in which you say, I have no delight in them. It's saying, young people, you need to think about this. It's saying, old people, if you don't know this before you're my age, you're this elderly person, you need to be aware of these things. If you don't know this as a foundation to life, if you don't know that none of this stuff matters, all the things you think are great, your lineage and your occupation and your religious your religious privileges and your wisdom, all these things you think are so wonderful, they don't actually mean anything. Unless you get that while you're young, you're going to spend a lot of your life chasing after nothingness. And that's why his favorite word seems to be vanity. Vanity or futility, depending on your translation. Maybe you think emptiness. Maybe you think worthlessness. I've used the word void for this lesson because that's really what it is. It's the place of nothing. These are all synonyms. They all work together. And however bad you think this is, you haven't seen anything yet. Because the old man, as much as he's talking in this section, and as much as you would think someone in this situation who's looking at life and seeing all these great accolades they have and then saying, this is worthless, you'd think he has a bunch of anger towards that, or maybe resentment or bitterness or some kind of irritation and frustration with it. But instead, when you read chapter 1, I don't read words from an angry person. The most striking part to this is you're reading words from a man who just doesn't have it in him to be angry anymore. He is so drained by life, and he's just so aware of what life is that he can't even bring himself to be angry at it. There's a hopelessness in his attitude. There's an emptiness to his feelings, even. That's all been removed because of how worthless all of this stuff is. The presumption of this older and wiser man is that nothing is worthwhile. And we, in our desperate struggle to keep life nice and pretend like everything's good, we fight against that. And we say, oh, that's pretty strong. I don't think that's quite right. There's plenty of stuff in life that's worthwhile. Why would somebody say something that extreme and that silly? Well, then you start to realize maybe he's just kind of right. He raises a question here. Does not nature itself teach you? Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, doesn't nature itself teach you that men have short hair, women have long hair? And he uses that framework. Here the Ecclesiastes writer, the preacher, Koheleth, is using this kind of idea to say, doesn't nature itself teach you that nothing in the world matters? We talk about a life cycle. We talk about a rain cycle. We talk about other cycles. And you watch stuff like, The Lion King as a child. I've still never seen The Lion King, but everybody tells me there's a song about the circle of life or something. And it's probably peppy and upbeat, and I couldn't sing it for you because I have no idea what it sounds like. But everybody has these positive, glowing reviews about that. And then Ecclesiastes comes in and beats you into the ground with the reality that the circle of life is garbage, and there's nothing you can do to escape it. What's the point? What's the point of work? He raises the question in verse 3. Fine, his thesis statement, futility of futilities, vanity of vanity, everything is worthless. Fine, you want an example of that? Verse 3. What advantage does a person have in all the work that he does under the sun? What's the point of work? Well, think about the point of work. Why do I go to work? Because when I work, I earn money, and that helps me to, what do you use money for? You use money for paying for like rent and for food to keep yourself alive. Okay, well, what do you do with all your life? Well, I do with my life is I go to work so that I can make money, so that I can live, so that I can go to work, so that I can, and you start to see the issue, don't you? What is the point of work? It's to get you trapped in this little cycle. It's like work gets you money, money gets you life, life makes you work. It's like this cosmic joke game of rock, paper, scissors where you're in the cycle and there is no answer and there is no way out to the cycle. People don't want to stop living, but if you live, you're inside this cycle. And even people who, there is no way out of it, and even if you could get out of the cycle by dying, either by natural causes or old age or whatever, or a lot of people opt to send themselves out of the cycle is the nicest possible way to say that. But what do you get even then? What is there outside of the cycle? What is there outside of this? If you give up life, you don't have anything left. And so we cling to life, but to cling to life, you have to do all these other things, and you're involved in a cycle where what advantage do you get? You don't get anything. You get money and then you use your money. And that's all there is to it. Life is a constant cycle. You cannot get out. And what else do you do in that? And of course, people still try to escape the inescapable conclusion. And so the author goes ahead and lays out his case even further. Here is the eternal cycle. Earth itself reinforces this eternal cycle. Did you know? And you just go through these verse by verse, and it just gets surer and surer. In verse 4, generations have the same cycle. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Did you know? Every generation is the same. Yes, kids these days have their own quirks, and yes, grown-ups these days have their own quirks, and yes, the great grown-ups, right, the grandparents, they have their own quirks. That's great. But at the end of the day, my grandparents are going to die. Actually, my grandparents are already dead. Okay? Don't have any around anymore. One day my parents are going to die. One day myself is going to die. One day my kids are going to die, and their kids are going to die, and the next one, and the next one. At the same time as my grandparents die, well, I have kids, and so that's going to, one generation is gone, one generation is coming in. As my parents die, my kids are going to have kids, and so one generation goes and one generation comes in, and it just keeps rotating out. Yeah, we have slightly different personalities. Yeah, we are in slightly different perspectives from, My granddad born in the early 1900s sometime. I'm born in not the early 1900s sometime. And my kids are definitely not going to be born in the early 1900s. And yet we're all still just part of the same thing. And we all still fundamentally have to work that gets us money, that gets us life, that gets us work. And nothing fundamentally changes. Individuals change, but life itself and the generational cycle doesn't. Did you know that every day is the same? The sun rises and the sun sets, and hurrying to its place, it rises there again. And that's all there is to it. The sun does its thing. It's literally a circuit. And of course, nowadays, we're so much more educated. In the old world, they used to believe that the sun rotated around the earth. But now we know that the earth rotates around the sun. Well, great. Do you know what that means? It means the earth is still going in a circle, literally. Actually, the earth is going in two circles because it spins and it also rotates in a circuit around the sun. And so it's going in two different circular directions, and neither of them is ever ending. What exactly do you get? Well, it's not just that, even. Did you know that the wind is always the same? It goes down to the south some days. It goes around to the north some days. Some days it's going every which direction. You have no idea where it's going. And it returns. And there's always wind. And even if it goes all the way around the earth, it'll always be wind. Did you know that water has a cycle? We literally call it the water cycle, don't we? The water in the ocean burns off, evaporates, goes up into the atmosphere, becomes clouds. Clouds end up dropping rain on the earth, and rain falls on the earth, and then the rain all trickles down to the ocean eventually, and then it evaporates from the ocean and goes right back up into the clouds, and it repeats over and over and over again. The wind seems like it's going places. The water seems like it's going places. None of them are, because life is trapped in this inane cycle. Did you know that your mind is the same way? In verse 8, all things are wearisome, no one can tell it, and yet the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. If you're listening to this, you have to ask the question, why? Number one, this is not highly produced. This is not like very professional. Why are you listening to this instead of something else that's very, very fancy? Thank you for listening, by the way. I hope you're benefiting by questioning everything about how useless life is. When you're thinking about this, why do you pursue things to listen? What do you have a record of the best sounds you've ever heard? Maybe, or the best songs. You have favorite songs, right? But are you ever satisfied with hearing them? Do you ever hear the song and say, wow, that was so perfect, I never want to listen to that again? Or do you listen to the same songs over and over to try and recapture that experience? Or do you go out and find new songs because you want a new song that strikes you in the same way that the old song did that one time? And yet, as soon as you find a new song that really resonates with you, then the quest is on to find another new song. The ear is never satisfied with hearing. You're always going after something. The mind runs in circles, in cycles. You cannot escape this. We wake up every day. We look at something. We look at a lot of times we look at the same things, or we go out and we seek a new experience and we seek something new to go out and look at, and then we see that thing and you're not satisfied with it. Maybe you are in the moment. You say, wow, that was pretty cool. But you can't just stand there and look at it forever. If you could, it would get boring. And since you can't, you get irritated. You either want to go back and see it, or you want to go out and find something else that's equally noteworthy to go and look at next time. And the fact is, every individual's mind is never going to be satisfied. We're always running in this cycle, seeking something new, but we can't get it. Did you know that history is the same way? Speaking of things that are new, or rather aren't new, did you know that history is all the same thing, and it always will be the same thing? People today like to say that we've progressed in history, and in some ways, sure, maybe we have, but in other ways, we haven't at all, and in the important ways, we haven't at all. Sure, we've passed some new laws. Sure, we've broken some old rules and made some new ones. Yeah, absolutely, yeah, right. We've changed the laws, but fundamentally, we haven't changed. Adam and Eve were created in a garden. They were given one rule. God said, hey, don't do that one thing. And that's the thing that they decided to do. And human beings are not any different nowadays. When we are told not to do something, that instantly becomes the thing that we want to do. That's how human beings work. History doesn't change. It's always just a cycle. People say history repeats itself, or people say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It's really close to what it was, and it really always will be, because that's how humans work. We're not going to evolve or change past the point of making trouble for ourselves. Did you know that technology works the same way? Is there anything of which one might say, see this, it is new? Hate to break it to you, it's already existed for ages, which were before us. There's a theory that runs around, and I'm not sure about the validity of this theory. I would have to look into it more myself, and I haven't done the requisite research. Some people believe that Abraham, when Abraham was called from the city of Ur, that would be 1875 BC, right, or something around that. It would be a long, long time ago. Some people believe that era already had 18th century or 19th century, like 1800s Industrial Revolution style technology back at that point. And then we lost it. There are apparently internal like in-house flushing toilets in Ur of the Chaldees from back in the day. We thought that was really cool when we invented it in the 1800s when the Industrial Revolution guys did that. We thought that was really cool. Guess what? It already existed. We thought it was really cool when we came up with a wheel. Well, guess what? Everybody's already had a wheel. Well, we came up with a written alphabet. Yeah, well, Moses had a written alphabet. Okay, well, we came up with law code. Well, yeah, Hammurabi already had a law code, didn't he? Okay, well, we came up with the design for cities. Okay, well, those have been happening for thousands of years. What exactly do you come up with that's going to be so new? People say we got telephones. Yeah, great. I'm glad your latest version of the iPhone is better than last year's version of the iPhone, which is exactly the same as the year before it, and the year before it, and the year before it. And sure, if you jump back 2,000 years to the days of Paul, then sure, absolutely, a phone allows you to text someone and get your written message across faster than writing something down on a paper and giving it to a messenger and having the messenger take it over. But fundamentally, you're still doing exactly the same thing. What exactly has technology done? How exactly new is it? I'm glad you invented the gun. It's just a slightly better bow and arrow. That's just a slightly better javelin. That's just a slightly better spear. Nothing is new. Of course, there are technically things that are new. We come up with new copyrights all the time. But they're really just reskins of all that old stuff. And none of it actually matters. Did you know your memory works in the same way? Here's a depressing one in verse 11. There is no remembrance of the earlier things, and of the later things as well, which will occur. There will be no remembrance of them among those who come later still. I know my parents. I know my grandparents. Well, they're all dead now, but I know who they were. I know their names. I don't know my great-grandparents. They were all dead way before I was born. I definitely don't know my great-great-grandparents. They were all dead a long time before I was born. You think about that, even if I go back 2 generations, yeah, I knew my grandparents to some extent, but I never really knew them, right? I didn't know too much about them. I know some details and such, but I don't know a ton, and the great-grandparents, I don't even know their names. By the time we get 3 generations removed from me, no one's going to know me. No one's going to know you either, because the fact is, neither of us are that important. Memory fades. And just like you've forgotten all your family's going to forget you. That's just how life goes. That's what's in the cycle. You don't remember what came before. Nobody remembers what comes after. Nobody that comes after will remember you either. When you think about this cycle, it's harsh to say, well, work doesn't actually benefit you because you stay part of the cycle and you can't get out of it. But then you think about every other thing that exists on the earth, and they're all reinforcing the same point. Nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. And you cannot escape. There's no thing on earth you're going to find that's going to get you out of the mundanity of the cycle that gets you into something else. There's a reason Koheleth is saying these things, and it's because he's right. He's an old man. He's had time to observe the earth, and he understands how this goes. He's watched generations upon generations go through the same stuff, And he's old enough to say, yeah, this is how it is. If you go through life expecting to find new things, if you go through life expecting to find some meaning, if you go through life expecting to find something that breaks you out of the boring nature of everything in this world that never ever changes, you're going to be disappointed because you can't find those things. They just don't exist. But that's still a sticking point for some people. What if he's wrong? What if Koheleth is just incorrect? Let's take up the futile struggle for a bit. Let's fight against that theory. What if there is something that's good? How can you say everything's bad? A lot of times we ask that question. I tend to say, a lot of things are bad. Sometimes I even say, that's bad when I haven't even tried that thing. If I see a food that doesn't look very good to me, I will say, oh, that's bad food, even if I'm not going to take a bite of it, because I don't want to take a bite of it. It looks bad, and therefore I equate that with it being bad, but I have no idea. Well, how can you say it's bad? Koheleth, teacher, Solomon maybe. How can you say that's bad if you've never tried it? Well, the point of chapter 2 is that he has tried it. But we'll get there in a couple weeks. Koheleth takes upon himself a mission in verses 12 through 18. Fine. You want me to provide evidence of this? Then fine. I will. I'm going to go and understand the earth. Verse 13, I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom about everything that has been done under heaven. It is a great calling, a great mission that he takes upon himself. And his answer to this, also in verse 13, his preemptive answer, before he goes into detail on everything that he's done in the rest of chapter 1 and going into chapter 2, he takes a moment to say this. It is a sorry task with which God has given the sons of mankind to be troubled. In other words, if I could paraphrase that, learning about the world is a curse God has given curious people. Because the more you learn, the more you realize how terrible it is. What a sorrowful job it is to understand what God has designed. And that is something where we hear someone say that. You may hear me say that and start to cringe a bit. That doesn't sound like something a faithful person can say. That doesn't sound like something a Christian would say. Certainly not. That doesn't sound like something that a believer in God would say. Don't we talk about the greatness of creation and how wonderful creation is? And the answer is, of course, yeah, of course creation is wonderful. It's wondrous. It's incredible. You take a human being. You look at the human being. It's fantastic on its own, but when you put it in with everything else, suddenly it gets kind of terrible. Think about an individual human being as the example, right? You look at a human, fantastic design. We have eyes. Eyeballs are so complicated. And the way the system in the head works to translate the eye process and everything else, ridiculously complex. And yet, it works, and it works really, really well. The hearing process is pretty complicated. You have several different bits in there, and yet they work very well. The brain process, the fact that we're able to move around and I don't even have to think about the things that I don't even consciously have to think about the words that I'm phrasing or the hand motions that I'm doing, because it just kind of happens. It's just a part of us. We don't have to activate, we don't have to specifically set aside regions in our brain to say, well, move this finger in this way. We just kind of do it, and it happens. It's fantastic design. But then you put two humans together, and you know what happens? You start to ask the question, okay, well, which one of us is going to be in charge? Okay, which one of us is going to have to work while the other one doesn't? And if in fact both of you two do work, well, you have to ask which one's working harder. Which one's more diligent? Which one's better than the other one? Is the one who works harder better because he's doing more work? Or is the one who works less better because he can do less work and get away with it? Which one of them is better? And we start comparing ourselves, and we start contrasting, and we start building hierarchies and structures and all these different things. Individually, humans are fantastic design, but the way nature plays out is really, really rough. It's cool to see a deer, and it's great to see a lion, but when you put a lion and a deer together, it is not going to go well for the deer. The more you understand about the earth, the more you understand about creation, yeah, there's an aspect of which it is fantastic, but then it's put together and it becomes a difficult world to live in. And that's as fundamental without complaint. I have seen all the works, verse 14, which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is futility. It is striving after the wind. Everything is broken on a fundamental level. His expectation in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened. Usually when we read through the Bible, we would think, well, God has made things straight, but we have made them crooked. Great. Well, also God has made them crooked because of how we sinned. He made everything perfect. Everything lived in harmony in the garden, presumably, and then mankind sinned, and so God made things crooked. He cast mankind out of the garden. You can argue that that's mankind's fault, and it is. You can also argue God has a hand in that, and he does. We usually argue it from mankind's fault because we don't want to find any fault with God, but the fact is, God has allowed predators and prey in the world. The fact is, God has allowed death and disease in the world. The fact is, God has allowed all sorts of terrible things to happen. That's his choice. He allows those things to exist. Everything is broken. We don't have perfect anymore. And in fact, we don't even know what perfect would look like because we just are so far away from it. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I don't even know how to talk about the way things could be or should be because I just don't even know. So far from perfection, you can't even voice a full complaint because you don't know what to complain about. That's the situation we're in. That's the kind of world we live in. We just don't know. We don't have the capacity to count what we lack. Everything is broken. He'll detail this more in chapter 2. We'll talk about this more in a couple weeks in chapter 2, but for now, just a brief taste of that. The preacher thinks maybe just I can find a little bit of hope here. I'll dive into wisdom. Wisdom is good. Wisdom is, it's great. It's glorious. Read Psalms, read Proverbs, read the things of Jesus. The preacher didn't have those, but Jesus did later on, and he speaks about the value of wisdom, right? Last Sunday night's sermon was the wise man and the foolish man, or it was several things, but we ended up at the wise man and the foolish man. Don't be the foolish man. That's the example. Be the wise man who builds his house on the rock. That's great. And there's a value that's placed in wisdom everywhere else in the Bible. And then you get to Ecclesiastes, and he kind of says it's worthless. It's not that it's entirely worthless. Wisdom is good, sure, but it's not going to fix your problem. It's not going to unbreak the world. It's not going to help you understand the earth, or it's not going to help you grapple with what understanding the earth leads to. Wisdom doesn't solve any of your problems. We'll talk about this later in the book several times over, but it just doesn't fix them. Wisdom and knowledge. His ultimate conclusion in verse 18 is, in much wisdom there is much grief. In increasing knowledge it results in increasing pain. What does that mean? What do you mean? Wisdom and knowledge aren't good for you? Question. Nowadays, it's the 21st century. It's 2026. We are so blessed, and we have these little phone devices that let us just, go online and look up whatever it is we want to. You can have news from the world over, news from your state, news from your city, news from your state, news from your country. If you don't live in, I guess other people don't live in the states, so maybe you live in a province or a territory or whatever it is. You can look up news in your country. You can look up news on your continent. You can look up news halfway across the world or the whole way across the world, and it just doesn't matter. You have access to every bit of information. Is your mind really more settled? Or has it gotten worse? Maybe knowledge isn't actually that helpful, because when I see all the news stories about the natural disasters going on over the world, I start to worry what happens to me instead of living in the world, in the place that I live, and not facing those things, at least not right now. When you're wise, wisdom is great, right? Wisdom lets you walk a wise path, but then you watch someone else who's walking like an idiot and goes and hurts themselves. Spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever it is. People who you know the right answer and you know the intelligent thing to do, and then you can advise someone and they ignore it, and you have to watch them do it to themselves. Does that really make you feel better? Knowing all your wisdom, having all your wisdom, you living rightly, does it really help you feel better when everyone else around you is living stupidly? Who is less agitated when they know the right answer and no one will listen to them? Yeah, there's a personal benefit to wisdom, sure, but wisdom itself is not going to help you, and it really doesn't turn into anything at all. There is pain in those things. Wisdom will not fix the struggle at a fundamental level. And if not even wisdom itself, which is so often prized and so often lauded, if not even wisdom itself can do anything to help you, then what can? Ecclesiastes doesn't exactly answer that question, or at least it doesn't for a long time. And instead, what he says is, well, maybe you weren't convinced by that. So let's read chapter 2 and go into all these different instances of the exact same stuff I'm talking about. As Paul would say in Romans chapter 7, who can save me from this body of death? I know it's ripping it out of context, but it's really true, isn't it? Who can save you from the cycle? Who can get you out of that? Ecclesiastes doesn't have anything. That's the first lesson. Welcome to the void. It's a nice place to be. This is not a hopeful book, but I said I would end with something that is not quite so depressing, and so here it is. I do want to end as much as possible, even though I know that staying true to the message of Ecclesiastes means removing all hopelessness. I'm hoping to preach in that way and to show you that there is no hope. But then also, when you zoom out and you think about the Bible in general, the Bible is insistent that there is hope. And so I'd like to point to, as depressing as all this can be, I want you to remember the context of this chapter. There is a very particular phrase that's going to come up in Ecclesiastes several times over, and it's this idea of remembering where this is happening, under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 in verse 3. What advantage does a person have in all his work which he does? Under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1 in verse 9. There is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 13, I have seen everything, I've explored by wisdom about everything that has been done under heaven, or under the sky, under the sun. And in verse 14, I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is futility and striving after wind. Under the sun is the shorthand phrase. It's not really even shorthand, it's just a phrase that talks about being on the earth, being here in the physical realm and thinking about things from this physical perspective. Everything is futility under the sun. But if there is an above the sun, if there is something beyond the physical perspective, if there is something spiritual, in other words, if God exists, as depressing as the world is, if God exists, I don't have to be stuck in the world forever. And that's the note of hope that there is. Everything in this book is contingent on this idea. Under the sun, it's worthless. Above the sun, there's plenty of value and hope. If you approach this physical life and think that this physical life is all there is, you will be depressed. And I hope that makes you turn around from that. Because Jesus came to show us that there is more than just this. You start with Ecclesiastes 1. You have to start here. You have to know how hopeless everything is, but you can't end here. This is not the end. You have to go further. Yes, this is depressing, but there is hope if you're willing and able to look beyond and look to God. Jesus himself would hint at these ideas when he would say, even in the Sermon on the Mount, which we talked about relatively recently, do not store up your treasure on earth, where the moth and the rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Why? Don't store your treasure up where? Not under the sun. It won't last under the sun. Store up your treasure in heaven instead. Everything is worthless unless you're following God. Everything is hopeless unless you have a God on the other side who's looking out for you and you are following after him. That's why we preach Christ. That's why we preach about God. That's why we teach his things. He does exist, and it's really important that we get that. If we don't understand that, then life is empty and hopeless. But when God is there, everything is fixed and better. So I'll leave you with that idea. Hopefully, there is plenty to think about there. Hopefully it stirs up some ideas in you or reminds you of things that you already know and gets your focus where it needs to be, which is on God and the important things. So, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed, although I'm not really sure if that is possible to say you enjoyed something like this, but I do hope you benefited and you learned something, or at least you're thinking towards God. That's what the point of this is. That's the hope. So, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Biblical Breadcrumbs.